It was once thought that the pituitary gland was the master gland because it secretes a lot of hormones that control other endocrine glands. But now we know that the pituitary, the master, has a master, and that ultimate master is the hypothalamus. Remember, the hypothalamus is that small little part of the brain just below the thalamus, and it's a major link between the nervous and the endocrine system. There are cells in the hypothalamus that make at least 9 different hormones, and the pituitary gland secretes about 7. Together, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland play a very important role in regulation of almost all aspects of growth, development, metabolism, and homeostasis. The pituitary gland is somewhat pea-shaped, and it measures about a ½ inch in diameter. And if you remember when you learned bones, you learned the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Well, the pituitary gland sits in that sella turcica. The pituitary gland and the hypothalamus are attached by a little stalk-like structure called the infundibulum. So the hypothalamus, of course, would be up here if we were looking at the complete brain. Within the infundibulum, we have a lot of axons of nervous tissue, and we have blood vessels. And both of these, of course, are going to connect the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. So the pituitary gland has 2 anatomically and functionally separate parts, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is also called the adenohypophysis. So hypophysis cerebri is the big fancy word for pituitary gland. So anterior hypophysis is the adenohypophysis, or adeno means gland, so glandular pituitary. It accounts for about 75% of the total weight of the pituitary gland, and it's made up of epithelial tissues. During embryonic development, the anterior pituitary develops from an upward pouching of the roof of the mouth, so it's made of epithelial tissues. The posterior pituitary is called the neurohypophysis. Neuro, of course, refers to nerve, and it's composed of nervous tissue. So during embryonic development, the posterior pituitary develops from a downward pouching of nervous tissue from the hypothalamus. So if you look at this image up here, we see the hypothalamus. Here, of course, we've got the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Here's the stalk that connects the two. So the hypothalamus is going to create hormones that are called releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. Those are going to travel through this blood vessel network here called the hypophyseal portal system. A portal system is where a lot of things come together into one entryway. So the hypothalamus will secrete releasing or inhibiting hormones. They'll travel through the infundibulum, through that hypophyseal portal system, to the anterior pituitary, where the anterior pituitary will then either be stimulated to release hormones, or the release of hormones will be inhibited, depending on what the hypothalamus released, right? The connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary is not shown here, but it is a network of axons where you have the cell bodies up here in the hypothalamus, and axons extend down to the posterior pituitary. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. The release of the anterior pituitary gland hormones is regulated partially by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus secretes 5 releasing hormones: growth hormone, releasing hormone; thyrotropin, releasing hormone, is going to stimulate the secretion of thyroid stimulating hormone; corticotropin, releasing hormone, is going to stimulate the secretion of adrenocorticotropic hormone; prolactin, releasing hormone, yeah, that was pretty easy, right? Stimulates the release of prolactin. And gonadotropin, releasing hormone, is going to stimulate the release of FSH and LH. So when you're learning all of these hormones, think about the pathway of what is controlling their release. So is it something that the hypothalamus controls by releasing an inhibiting or stimulating hormone that tells the pituitary gland to release a hormone? And then does that target another gland to release another hormone? So let's look at this. For instance, if these neurosecretory cells here in the hypothalamus are making growth hormone, releasing hormone, and releasing that growth hormone releasing hormone into the hypophyseal portal system and down into the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary makes growth hormone, which then is going to secrete growth hormone that will target bone, muscle, and adipose tissue. That's going to increase mitosis in those tissues and cause growth to occur. If these neurosecretory cells are releasing thyrotropin releasing hormone, that's going to travel to the anterior pituitary, which will release thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid. Then the thyroid releases T3 and T4, which increase metabolism. If the hypothalamus neurosecretory cells are releasing corticotropin releasing hormone, it targets the anterior pituitary, which releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, which targets the adrenal cortex, which then releases several different hormones, including cortisol. If your neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus are releasing prolactin releasing hormone, it targets cells in the anterior pituitary, which release prolactin, which targets the breast and causes milk to be produced. If your neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus are releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone, it targets the anterior pituitary, which then releases follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which targets the ovaries and the testes and causes estrogen or testosterone to be made, causes egg cells to mature, or causes sperm cells to be created. So think of that as a pathway. It all began with the hypothalamus releasing hormones that stimulated the anterior pituitary to release hormones, which may have stimulated another gland to release hormones. This slide and the next gives you a nice little table of the anterior pituitary and the hormones from the hypothalamus that can control their secretion. So the anterior pituitary, AP, secretes growth hormone. Growth hormone is going to be stimulated to be released by growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus can also inhibit the anterior pituitary by secreting growth hormone inhibiting hormone that stops growth hormone from being released. So somatostatin, somato means body. Okay, so growth hormone, I'm sorry, this should not be right here. Let me back that up. Mark this out. Growth hormone is not known as somatostatin. That's an error on that slide. Growth hormone is growth hormone, right? So growth hormone releasing hormone causes it to be secreted. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone causes it to be inhibited. Somatostatin, body, same. Okay? Thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary is stimulated to be released by the hypothalamus releasing thyrotropin releasing hormone, but it's inhibited also by growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary is released under the stimulation of gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary is stimulated to be released by gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Prolactin hormone from the anterior pituitary is stimulated to be released by prolactin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. It's inhibited by prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is also dopamine. This is what is sometimes given to women in the hospital if they don't wish to breastfeed after childbirth, and it helps to dry up the milk in the breast. Adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary is released under the control of corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And then, the last hormone from the anterior pituitary, melanocyte stimulating hormone, is released under the control of corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and inhibited by dopamine from the hypothalamus. All right, so let's look at a particular negative feedback here with the control from the hypothalamus. So the release of anterior pituitaries is regulated not only by the hypothalamus, but also by negative feedback. So the secretory activity of three different types of anterior pituitary cells, the thyrotrophs, corticotrophs, and gonadotrophs, decrease when blood levels of their target gland hormones rise. For example, if the adrenal gland is secreting sufficient cortisol, then the negative feedback is going to prevent corticotropin releasing hormone being released from the hypothalamus. It's also going to prevent corticotropin or adrenocorticotropin from being released from the anterior pituitary. Why? Because the cortisol levels are already high enough, so the negative feedback prevents them from releasing, stimulating more and more to be released. But if cortisol levels drop, blood sugar levels drop, then this pathway resumes. Corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropin hormone, which stimulates the adrenal gland to release cortisol. So it's not just the hypothalamus controlling the pituitary. The anterior pituitary also has several hormones that are controlled by the negative feedback of the levels of those hormones circulating in the blood. So let's start looking at some of these pituitary gland hormones and their actions. So human growth hormone is the most abundant of all of the anterior pituitary hormones. It causes growth of body tissues, especially bones and muscles and adipose tissue, helps to regulate metabolism. It exerts growth-promoting effects indirectly through small protein hormones called insulin-like growth factor. So in response to growth hormone, there are cells in the liver and muscle and cartilage and bone that secrete this insulin-like growth factor. Insulin-like growth factor from the liver enters the bloodstream and travels out like a hormone, as a hormone, to target tissues throughout the body. But the insulin-like growth factors produced in the muscle and the cartilage and the bone act in those tissues, so they're autocrine or paracrine, and they cause growth in those same tissues. So what happens when we release growth hormone? Then it increases mitosis. So let's look briefly at the controlling factors first. So we've already talked about the hypothalamus releasing growth hormone, releasing hormone, and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And of course that's going to control how that hormone is released from the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary does release growth hormone every few hours in bursts, but especially during sleep. So under the control of these two hormones, of course, the releasing and inhibiting hormone, those bursts are released. So here's the pathway. Growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is secreted. It travels to the anterior pituitary. Growth hormone then is released from the anterior pituitary and is traveling through the blood out to target cells, primarily in bones and muscles and adipose tissue, and it's going to stimulate mitosis to occur. Now, when that mitosis is occurring, of course, body structures are growing. I want you to think about how long bones grow. Remember, for a long bone to grow, you have to have cartilage still in the epiphyseal plates, right? So in bones, that insulin-like growth factor that's released from the bone is going to stimulate osteoblasts to build bone. It's going to stimulate those cartilage cells to undergo mitosis and create more and more and more chondrocytes. Remember, that's cartilage cells. Those osteoblasts then are going to ossify or turn that cartilage into bone, and that long bone is going to grow in length. It also causes an increase in proteins being made because we've got to have more protein to build more bone matrix. And in soft tissue like skeletal muscle and kidneys and intestine, the insulin-like growth factors cause increased uptake of amino acids into cells so that more and more and more proteins can be made. So when growth hormone levels are low, then negative feedback, of course, is going to cause more growth hormone releasing hormone to be released, which causes more growth hormone to be released, which targets body tissues and increases metabolism. Yeah, I realized I just said metabolism. I should have said increased mitosis. Now, you have bursts of growth hormone, of course, as you are young and you're growing, but we also, as adults, have bursts of growth hormone that's released Some of the things that can stimulate growth hormone to be released are low blood sugar, hypoglycemia, decreased blood levels of fatty acids or amino acids, when you are deeply asleep, and some of the sex hormones, the estrogens and testosterones and thyroid hormones. So when these levels are fluctuating, we release that growth hormone, releasing hormone, to lead to more growth hormone. One of the actions of growth hormone is also to increase blood sugar as well. All right, what else did I want to tell you on this one? Oh, I think I'm ready for disorders. All right, so a couple of disorders associated with growth hormone. Remember what growth hormone does. It causes increased metabolism by targeting primarily bone, muscle, and adipose tissue and causing increased mitosis in those tissues. And again, reminding you, your long bones grow long when you still have active epiphyseal plates, right? When the bones can grow. So if you have excess growth hormone that is released during your childhood, then those long bones are going to grow very long. So increase the insulin-like growth factors causes more and more cartilage cells to undergo mitosis, and then of course those bones become ossified and the bones become very long, and this can lead to a condition called gigantism, as you see here in this small black and white image in the lower part of the page. But what about once you're grown? Once your bones have fully ossified and you no longer have that growth plate, right? So you have an epiphyseal line that has fully ossified. During that time, of course, the long bones can no longer grow long, but you can develop a condition known as acromegaly. And that's when you have hypersecretion of growth hormone during adulthood. So the growth hormone can't cause the bones to grow in length because the epiphyseal plates are already closed, but they can cause bones to grow appositionally or to become thicker. You typically see this most prominently in the bones of the face, the feet, and the hands, because those are the more superficial bones, of course, that are closest to the surface. So all bones are targeted, but you see it most in the bones of the face, feet, and hands, as you can see here in this particular hand and in this gentleman's face, how those bones have increased. The other side of that, or the other disorder associated with that, of course, is dwarfism. Pituitary dwarfism develops when you have hyposecretion of growth hormone during those growth years, so that the bones are not stimulated to undergo mitosis at the normal level, and the epiphyseal plates end up closing before normal height is reached. So that, as you can see in this particular image, most of these are suffering, most if not all of these people suffer from pituitary dwarfism. I want to go ahead and put this in here for a summary of some of the anterior pituitary hormones. As we've already talked about growth hormone, we're going to talk more about the thyroid gland and the hormones and some of the other hormones that are affected by the anterior pituitary as we talk about each of the individual glands. But this does give us sort of a summary or an overview of the action. So as we've talked about, as I mentioned, with growth hormone is also known as somatotropin. Tropin means change, somato, of the body. So we've seen already that growth hormone is going to stimulate mitosis and also the secretion of insulin-like growth factor, and that causes the growth of body tissues. It also, of course, is going to cause mitosis that helps us to maintain and rebuild body structures, and also has an effect on blood sugar. Thyroid stimulating hormone, I bet you could figure that one out, right? Thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, its only role is to stimulate the thyroid. So the targets for thyroid stimulating hormone, the thyroid gland. And then it will, of course, stimulate the thyroid gland to release its hormones. Follicle stimulating hormone is under the control of gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Remember, we saw this a while ago. Follicle stimulating hormone targets the ovaries and the testes. In the female, follicle stimulating hormone is going to cause these little bag-like structures called follicles to increase their size. Inside those follicles are the oocytes, the developing eggs. As the follicles get bigger and bigger and bigger, then estrogen levels increase as well because the follicular cells, the cells of the follicle, make estrogen. In the male, follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates spermatogenesis, or making of sperm cells, to occur. Luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary also targets the ovaries and the testes. In the female, it stimulates the secretion of estrogen and progesterone, but its biggest role is to stimulate ovulation to occur, so that that most mature egg cell each month is then ovulated out into the fallopian tubes where fertilization can occur. Once ovulation occurs, that empty follicle then is going to form a structure called the corpus luteum that will secrete lots of estrogen and progesterone just in case pregnancy occurs, so it prepares the uterus by keeping it very vascular and gooey. Luteinizing hormone in the male targets the testes and stimulates other cells in the testes to secrete testosterone. Again, you'll get more of this when we get into the reproductive system later in the semester. Prolactin from the anterior pituitary is going to target the breast. So along with other hormones, prolactin initiates and maintains milk production by the mammary glands. By itself, though, it has a very weak effect. But after the mammary glands have sort of been primed by estrogens and progesterones and glucocorticoids and growth hormone and thyroid hormone and insulin, all of which have a permissive effect, then prolactin can start milk production. Now, I said production. Ejection of milk from the mammary glands is under the control of oxytocin, which we'll talk more about with the posterior pituitary. But together, milk production and milk ejection, it's what we call lactation. The hypothalamus secretes both an inhibitory and excitatory hormone that regulates prolactin secretion. In females, prolactin inhibiting hormone, also known as dopamine, inhibits the release of prolactin from the anterior pituitary most of the time. But every month, just before menstruation occurs, the secretion of prolactin inhibiting hormone goes down. So the blood level of prolactin rises. Not enough to make milk production, but enough to cause breasts to become very tender because of that elevated prolactin. As the menstrual cycle begins again each month, prolactin inhibiting hormone is secreted again and the prolactin level drops. During pregnancy, though, the prolactin level rises and is stimulated by prolactin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. This action is further increased by the infant nursing because that inhibits the inhibiting hormone from being released. Males also make prolactin. Doesn't sound like they would need it, though, right? Well, we don't know exactly why, but if they do have or we don't know exactly why they secrete it, but we do know that hypersecretion of prolactin in the male can cause erectile dysfunction in female, and also it can cause growth of the mammary glands of the breast tissue in the male. In females, hypersecretion can cause galactorrhea or inappropriate lactation when you're not supposed to be producing milk, and can also cause amenorrhea or the absence of the menstrual cycle. Adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids, primarily cortisol, and again we'll talk about those hormones when we do the adrenal cortex. Melanocyte stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary increases skin pigmentation, primarily in amphibians, by stimulating the making and release of melanin granules in melanocytes. Now remember, we have melanocytes in our skin that produce melanin, and that gives us skin color. But the melanocytes are really not that active in creating skin color once we have a skin color. Now we can stimulate them to make a little more melanin by being exposed to the skin, and our skin tans, but it's not a major role once we're born. But there are melanocyte receptors that are in the brain, so there's some studies that say it may have the melanocyte stimulating hormone may have some influence over brain activity. but we have very little of the MSH circulating in the humans.